She fell to her knees in the desert, begging the cowboy to love her one last time. The desert stretched endlessly under a burning sun, its surface shimmering like melted glass. Heat rose in shaky waves from the dry sand, making everything in the distance look blurred and unreal. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue, so wide that it felt almost too big for one person to stand beneath it alone. There was no sound except the slow whisper of the wind, which carried tiny grains of sand across the open land like restless spirits. In the middle of this vast emptiness walked a young woman, moving slowly but with quiet determination. Her feet sank into the hot sand with every step, leaving behind a trail that the wind quickly began to erase. She was not dressed for comfort or beauty, only for survival. Her light dress was covered in dust, her skin tanned by the sun, and her long hair tied loosely to keep it out of her face. Still, stray strands fell over her eyes, sticking to her sweaty skin. Her name did not matter to the desert. To the wind, she was just another lonely traveler. But inside her heart, she carried a story heavier than any burden she could hold in her hands. Each step forward felt like both punishment and purpose. She did not walk because she wanted to. She walked because she had no choice. Her face showed deep exhaustion, yet also a stubborn strength. Her eyes, though tired, were filled with emotion that refused to fade. Sometimes, as she walked, she looked down at the ground, watching her own footsteps disappear. Other times, she stared straight ahead, as if searching for something she was afraid to truly hope for. The sun beat down on her mercilessly, drying her throat and making her lips crack. She had a small bottle of water, but she sipped it carefully, knowing she might need every last drop before her journey ended. The air felt thick and heavy in her lungs, and with each breath she felt the weight of the desert pressing against her. As she moved forward, her mind drifted back to memories she had tried to bury. She remembered a time when this same desert had felt different to her. Back then, the wind had carried laughter instead of loneliness. The sun had felt warm instead of cruel. But that time was gone, washed away like footprints in the sand. She thought of a small wooden house on the edge of the desert, simple but full of meaning. She could almost see it in her mind. The faded porch, the creaking door, the smell of dust and wood mixed together. That place had once felt like home to her, even though she had not been born there. It had become her home because of one person.
That person was a cowboy. She pictured him clearly as she walked.
A tall man with a strong build, worn boots, and a hat that always shaded his eyes. His face had been shaped by years of hard work under the sun. His hands were rough, but when he touched something gently, it felt safe. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. She remembered the first time she had seen him riding across the desert on his horse. The dust had risen behind him like a golden cloud, and for a moment she had thought he looked like something out of a dream. He had stopped when he saw her standing near the edge of the road, her bags at her feet, looking lost and unsure. Back then, she had been running from something, though she had not fully understood it herself. He had looked at her quietly, studied her face, and then offered her water without asking any questions. That simple kindness had touched her more deeply than she could explain. Now, as she walked alone through the same desert, that memory felt both sweet and painful. The wind grew stronger, lifting sand into the air and swirling it around her. She raised her arm to shield her face, her heart beating faster as the air filled with gritty dust. For a moment, she had to stop, closing her eyes and waiting for the storm to pass. The desert was unpredictable, and she knew better than to challenge it. When the wind finally softened again, she lowered her arm and continued walking. Her legs felt weak, but her will was stronger. Somewhere ahead, she believed he was still there. Still living in that small house. Still riding his horse across the endless land. Still carrying the same silence in his heart. As she walked, she noticed how different the desert felt compared to her memories. The color seemed harsher now, the silence louder. The beauty she once saw in the golden sand had been replaced by a sense of isolation. It was as if the land itself was reminding her that she did not belong here anymore. Still, she pressed on. She thought about how their lives had once been intertwined like two paths that had suddenly crossed. She had brought warmth and emotion into his quiet world. He had given her stability and protection in return. They had spoken little but understood each other deeply. At least, that was what she had believed. Now she wondered if that understanding had ever truly been real. As the hours passed, the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Long shadows stretched across the sand, making the land look even more vast and empty. The air grew slightly cooler, offering her a small relief from the heat. She stopped for a moment, standing still and looking around. In the distance, she thought she saw a faint shape against the horizon. Her heart skipped a beat. For a second, she told herself it was only her imagination playing tricks on her. But then she stared harder. It was a silhouette, a man on horseback. The sight made her breath catch in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly, and she felt a rush of emotion flood through her. Joy, fear, hope, and pain all mixed together in her chest. She did not know whether to run toward him or turn back. The figure remained far away, almost like a shadow against the glowing sky. She could not see his face, only his outline as he sat tall on his horse, still and silent. The horse moved slowly, its head lowered as it walked across the sand. For a long moment she simply stood there, watching. The desert around her seemed to disappear, as if everything had narrowed down to just her and that distant figure. The wind, the heat, the loneliness, all of it faded into the background. All she could focus on was the man she had traveled so far to find. Her heart began to pound harder, not from exhaustion but from emotion. She felt her eyes sting with tears, though she refused to let them fall. She had come too far to break down now. She took a small step forward, then another. The sand shifted beneath her feet, but she did not stop. She moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid that one sudden movement might make the figure vanish like a mirage. Her mind raced with questions she had no answers to. Would he recognize her? Would he even care that she had returned? Would he turn his horse and ride away? As she walked, memories continued to flood her thoughts. She remembered sitting beside him in the evenings, watching the sun disappear behind the dunes. She remembered the quiet way he had once placed his jacket over her shoulders when the night grew cold. She remembered the way he used to avoid looking directly at her when his feelings became too strong. But she also remembered the distance that had slowly grown between them, the silence that had stretched longer and longer, the moments when he had turned away instead of reaching for her, the pain of feeling unwanted, even when she loved him more than anything. The desert breeze brushed against her face again, gentler this time. It felt almost like a whisper, as if the land itself was urging her forward. She took another deep breath and kept walking. The figure on horseback did not move toward her, but he did not move away either. He simply stayed there, like a still picture against the fading light. The space between them felt both impossibly large and painfully small. With each step she took, her heart grew heavier. She knew that reaching him would not solve everything. She knew that love was not something she could simply demand or force, yet she could not stop herself from trying. The desert around her slowly darkened as the sun dipped closer to the horizon. The sky turned a deep purple, sprinkled with the first faint stars of evening. The air grew cooler, and the shadows stretched even longer across the sand. Still, she walked. Her body was tired, her feet aching, but her spirit pushed her onward. She had crossed cities, roads, and now this endless desert for a reason. She had come to face the man who still lived in her heart, whether he wanted her there or not. And as the last light of the day faded, leaving the desert wrapped in soft twilight, she continued toward the distant cowboy, carrying both her hope and her heartbreak with every step. The memory of that first meeting stayed with her as clearly as if it had happened only yesterday. In her mind, the desert suddenly changed from an empty wasteland into a place filled with moments, emotions, and unspoken feelings that had shaped her life. Years earlier, she had not come to the desert by choice. She had been running from a life that felt too heavy, too confusing, and too painful. The city where she had grown up had felt crowded, loud, and suffocating. People spoke too much, judged too quickly, and cared too little. She had wanted silence, space, and somewhere she could breathe without feeling trapped. She had arrived at a small roadside stop with nothing but a worn bag and a heart full of uncertainty. The sun had been just as harsh that day, and the heat had made her dizzy. She had stood there alone, unsure where to go next, when she had first seen him. He had been riding slowly across the dusty path, his horse moving with calm patience. His hat had shaded most of his face, but she could see his strong jaw and the seriousness in his posture. He had not been in a hurry. Everything about him seemed steady, controlled, and deeply rooted in the land around him. When he noticed her, he had pulled gently on the reins, bringing his horse to a stop. For a long moment he had simply looked at her, not in a rude or questioning way, but with quiet curiosity. She had felt seen in a way she had not felt in years. Without saying much, he had reached into a saddlebag and handed her a small metal bottle filled with cool water. His hand had been rough from years of work, but his movement had been careful, almost gentle. She had thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might break the strange peace of the moment. He had nodded once, then turned his horse toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the desert. Before riding away, he had looked back at her one last time, as if silently asking whether she would follow or stay behind. Something inside her had urged her forward. She had gathered her bag and walked after him, not knowing why she trusted him so easily, only knowing that she felt safe in his presence. The path had led to a small wooden house standing alone against the endless sand. It had looked simple and weathered, but solid, like the man himself. That house had become her shelter. He had not asked her many questions about her past, and she had been grateful for that. Instead, he had shown her how to survive in the desert. He had taught her how to listen to the wind, how to recognize the signs of an approaching sandstorm, and how to ration water so it would last. At first, their days had been filled with silence. He would leave early in the morning to check on his cattle, riding far across the land while she stayed behind to clean, cook, and adjust to her new surroundings. The desert had felt intimidating at first, but slowly it began to feel like home. In the evenings, he would return just as the sun began to set, dust clinging to his clothes and horse. She would hand him a cup of water, and he would give her a small nod of appreciation. They did not talk much, but there was comfort in their quiet routine. Over time, their relationship grew naturally, like a plant slowly taking root in dry soil. She began to notice small things about him that others might have missed, the way his shoulders relaxed lightly when he saw her waiting on the porch, the way his expression softened when she laughed at something silly, the way he avoided looking directly at her when his feelings seemed too close to the surface. She, in turn, started to feel something deeper than simple gratitude or companionship. When she watched him ride across the desert at dawn, she felt her heart pull toward him. When he sat beside her at night, staring into the distance, she wished she could understand the thoughts behind his quiet eyes. There were moments when it felt like they were perfectly in tune with each other. One evening, a sudden storm had rolled across the desert. The wind had howled fiercely, throwing sand against the walls of the house like sharp rain. She had been terrified, unsure if the fragile-looking building could withstand such force. He had stayed calm, boarding up the windows and making sure she was safe inside. As the storm raged outside, they had sat close together near a small lantern. The room had been filled with flickering shadows, and for the first time she had felt the full weight of his presence beside her. She had wanted to say something meaningful, but no words had come. Instead, he had placed his hand gently over hers, a simple gesture that had meant more than any speech. In that moment, she had believed that they were connected in a way that could not be broken. Days turned into months. She learned to ride beside him, clinging nervously to the back of his horse at first, then growing more confident with each journey. He showed her the hidden beauty of the desert, the way the sand glowed like gold at sunrise, the way the sky turned soft pink at dusk, the way small wildflowers managed to bloom even in such harsh conditions. She began to feel like she belonged there. But beneath their growing closeness, something remained unsettled. He carried a heaviness inside him that he rarely spoke about. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear him moving restlessly, unable to sleep. Other times, she would catch him staring out across the desert with a distant, troubled expression. She wanted to ask him what troubled him, but she feared pushing too hard. She had her own wounds, and she understood how painful it could be to open them up. Still, she sensed that there was a wall around his heart, one that he was not ready to lower completely. As time passed, small cracks began to appear in their once peaceful bond. There were days when he seemed more distant than usual, riding farther than necessary and returning later than before. When she asked if something was wrong, he would simply shake his head and change the subject. She began to feel insecure, wondering if she had imagined the depth of their connection. The warmth she had once felt between them started to feel uncertain, like a fading fire.
One day, while he was away, she had met an older woman who lived on the edge of another desert settlement. The woman had warned her gently that cowboys like him often built emotional walls because they feared losing the people they loved.
Those words had stayed with her. She began to see his distance not as rejection, but as fear. Fear of attachment, fear of vulnerability, fear of being hurt again. Instead of pulling away, she tried even harder to show him love and patience. But love, she would later learn, could not survive on patience alone. There came a turning point one evening when she had finally gathered the courage to speak openly about her feelings. They had been sitting outside, the stars bright above them, the desert silent except for the soft breeze. Her voice had trembled as she told him how much he meant to her, how safe she felt with him, how she believed they could build a real life together. She had poured her heart out, holding nothing back. He had listened in silence. When she finished, he had not spoken right away. His face had remained unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. The silence between them had felt heavy, almost painful. Finally he had spoken, his voice low and careful. He had told her that he was not sure he was capable of the kind of love she wanted, that the desert had shaped him into someone who lived alone, relied on himself, and kept his heart guarded. He had not said he did not care for her, but his words had carried an unspoken message. He was afraid to fully let her in. Her heart had broken in that moment, though she had tried to hide it. She had felt tears sting her eyes, but she had refused to cry in front of him. Instead, she had nodded slowly, pretending to understand, even though every part of her had been aching inside. From that night on, things had never been the same. Their conversations grew shorter. The warmth between them cooled. The house that had once felt like a safe haven began to feel like a place filled with unsaid words and unfulfilled hopes. She had tried to stay strong, telling herself that love sometimes took time. But deep down she had felt the distance between them growing wider with each passing day. Eventually, the pain of staying had become too much. She had packed her bag one morning while he was still out riding. Her hands had shaken as she folded her clothes, memories of their time together flashing through her mind. She had stood in the doorway looking back at the house that had once meant so much to her. When he had returned and seen her ready to leave, he had not begged her to stay. He had simply stood there, his expression torn between relief and regret. They had shared one final painful look before she had turned and walked away. Now, as she crossed the desert years later, those memories weighed heavily on her heart. She understood now that their story had never been simple. It had been filled with love, fear, silence, and missed chances. Yet despite everything, she could not forget him. The wind brushed against her face once more, pulling her back to the present. Ahead of her, the distant figure on horseback remained still against the darkening sky. The past and present seemed to blur together as she continued walking toward him, carrying all those memories with her. She did not know what awaited her when she finally reached him. But she knew one thing with certainty: her heart still belonged to the cowboy of the desert. The days after that quiet confession had changed everything between them, even though nothing dramatic had happened on the surface. The desert looked the same, the house stood in the same place, and the sun still rose and set in its usual slow rhythm. Yet the feeling inside the house had shifted, like a glass that had cracked but had not yet shattered. The cowboy began leaving earlier in the mornings and returning later at night. He told himself that he simply had more work to do, more ground to cover, more cattle to check. But deep inside, he knew that part of him was avoiding the weight of her feelings. He did not want to face the softness in her eyes or the hope that still lingered there. She noticed every change. When he saddled his horse before sunrise, she would stand quietly in the doorway, watching him prepare without speaking. Once, she had tried to hand him water as she always did, but he had taken it quickly, avoiding her gaze. That small moment had hurt her more than any harsh words could have. Inside, she felt torn. One part of her wanted to chase after him, to grab his arm and force him to talk, to make him see how deeply she cared. Another part of her understood his fear and did not want to push him further away, so she stayed still, swallowing her pain and pretending that everything was normal. The house felt emptier during the day without him. She busied herself with chores, sweeping the dusty floors, preparing simple meals, and keeping herself occupied so her thoughts would not run wild. Sometimes she would step outside and stare across the endless desert, wondering if he was thinking about her the same way she was thinking about him. There were moments when she felt certain that he loved her but was too afraid to admit it. Other times doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps she had imagined their connection, that maybe she had been the only one who had truly felt something deep.
As weeks passed, their communication grew thinner.
They still sat together in the evenings, but the silence between them felt different now. It was no longer a comfortable shared quiet.
Instead, it was heavy, filled with words neither of them dared to say. One night, a strong wind rattled the windows as they sat near the lantern.
The shadows flickered across the walls, making the room feel smaller and more suffocating. She watched him carefully, noticing how tense his shoulders looked, how his jaw remained tightly set. She wanted to reach out to him, to place her hand on his, like she had during the storm months before, but something held her back. She feared that this time he might pull away. Instead, she spoke softly. She told him that she understood his need for space, that she was willing to wait if it meant he could feel safe. Her voice trembled slightly, but she tried to sound calm. She did not want to appear weak, even though her heart felt fragile. He listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the small flame of the lantern. When she finished, he let out a slow breath, almost like a sigh he had been holding in for too long. He did not look at her, but his voice, when he spoke, carried a hint of pain. He said that waiting might not change who he was, that the desert had shaped him into someone who kept his emotions locked away, he admitted, in his own quiet way that caring deeply frightened him because he had lost people before. His words were honest, but they cut her like a blade. She realized then that no matter how much love she gave him, it might never be enough to break down the walls he had built around himself. The thought filled her with sadness so deep that it felt almost physical. Still, she stayed. She told herself that love required patience, sacrifice, and strength.
She believed that if she remained by his side long enough, he would eventually let her in completely. She clung to that hope, even as it slowly began to slip through her fingers. But time, instead of healing their bond, only widened the distance. He became more distant with each passing day.
He stopped sharing small details about his work, stopped asking about her thoughts, stopped meeting her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. The warmth that had once existed between them faded like a fire left unattended. She began to feel invisible in the very place that had once felt like home. One afternoon, while he was away, she wandered farther from the house than she ever had before. The desert stretched endlessly around her, but she felt a strange calm in its vastness. The wind brushed against her face, carrying whispers of freedom she had almost forgotten. She climbed a small dune and sat at the top, staring out at the horizon. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to think clearly about her situation. She realized that staying in the house pretending everything was fine was slowly breaking her spirit. She loved him, yes, but she also loved herself enough to know that she could not live forever in uncertainty. That evening, when he returned, she decided to speak again. They sat outside under the growing darkness, the stars beginning to glitter above them. The air was cool, and the desert was silent except for the soft sound of the wind. She told him calmly that she could no longer ignore the distance between them. She explained that she needed honesty, clarity, and at least some reassurance that their bond meant something real to him. Her voice was steady, but inside, her heart was pounding. He listened, his face unreadable as always. When she finished, he stood up slowly, turning his back to her and looking out across the desert. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt unbearable. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. He said that he cared for her more than he had cared for anyone in a long time. But he also admitted that love scared him in a way he could not fully explain. He feared that if he opened his heart completely, he might lose her someday, just as he had lost others before. His honesty was raw, but it was not the answer she had been hoping for. She felt tears well up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She understood his fear, yet she could not accept a life built on hesitation and emotional distance. That night marked the true breaking point between them. Over the next few days, their interactions became even more strained. They spoke only when necessary, and even then, their words felt hollow. The house, once filled with quiet warmth, now felt cold and distant. She found herself spending more time outside, walking across the desert just to escape the tension inside. Each step she took across the sand reminded her of how far she had already traveled in her life, both physically and emotionally. One morning, as the sun began to rise, she made her final decision. She woke before him and quietly began packing her belongings. Her hands moved slowly, almost numb, as she folded her clothes and placed them into her worn bag. Each item she touched carried a memory. The first time she had cooked for him, the evening they had sat close during the storm, the day he had taught her to ride. Her heart ached with every memory. When he finally stirred and saw her packing, he froze in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared at each other across the small room, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. She could see conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to stop her, to beg her to stay, to finally admit how much she meant to him. But another part of him held him back, trapped behind the walls of fear he had built so carefully. He said nothing. She waited, hoping against hope that he would reach out, that he would say something that would make her change her mind. But the silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, she closed her bag and stood up. She walked toward the door, pausing only once to look back at him. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment she saw both love and regret reflected in his gaze. But it was not enough. With a deep breath, she turned and stepped out into the desert. The sand felt hot beneath her feet as she began walking away from the house that had once been her refuge. Behind her, she could hear the soft sound of his boots shifting, but he did not follow. As she moved farther from the house, her heart felt both broken and strangely lighter. She was leaving behind a place that had shaped her, but she was also choosing herself over a love that could not fully exist. The desert stretched endlessly before her, just as it had on the day she had first arrived. The sun rose higher in the sky, painting the sand in shades of gold and orange. Behind her, the cowboy stood alone in the doorway, watching her fade into the distance. His chest felt tight, his heart heavy with emotions he could not bring himself to express. He did not move. He did not call out. And so she walked away, carrying both her love and her heartbreak across the endless desert. Now, years later, as she walked once again toward that same man on horseback, those painful memories filled her mind. She understood now that their breaking point had not come from anger or betrayal, but from fear, silence, and two hearts that had never fully met. Ahead of her, the distant figure remained still against the darkening sky. The past and present began to blur together as she continued forward, knowing that the moment she had left behind long ago was finally about to return, and this time she would face it with everything she carried inside her. Years had passed since the day she walked away from the small wooden house in the desert. The world beyond that lonely land had been busy, loud, and full of movement, but her heart had never fully left that quiet place. No matter where she went, the image of the cowboy, standing silently in the doorway, followed her like a shadow. After leaving, she had tried to build a new life in a nearby town. She found a small job helping at a cafe, waking early each morning to prepare food and serve customers. The work kept her hands busy, but her mind was rarely at rest. Every quiet moment reminded her of the desert, the soft wind, the endless horizon, and the man who still lived there. People in town were kind to her. Some asked about her past, curious about where she had come from, but she never shared much. She smiled politely, changed the subject, and kept her memories locked away. Only at night, when the world fell silent, did she allow herself to think about him. She often wondered what he was doing.
Was he still riding across the desert at dawn? Was he still living alone in that weathered house?
Had he ever thought about her after she left? These questions circled her mind like restless birds, never settling. At first she had believed that time would heal her pain. She told herself that with enough distance, her feelings would fade. But instead of disappearing, they only seemed to grow deeper. The more she tried to forget him, the more clearly she remembered every small detail. His steady voice, his quiet presence, the way the desert felt when he was near. One evening, while closing the cafe, she overheard two travelers speaking at a nearby table. They were dusty, tired, and clearly passing through town. One of them mentioned a lone cowboy who still lived far out in the desert, tending to his cattle and rarely visiting anyone. Her heart had jumped at those words. She pretended not to listen, but every part of her leaned closer to their conversation. When one traveler described the small wooden house at the edge of the dunes, she felt a sudden rush of emotion that nearly overwhelmed her. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, memories flooding her thoughts. The sound of the desert wind echoed in her mind, and she could almost feel the heat of the sand beneath her feet again. For the first time in years, she seriously considered returning. But fear held her back. What if he no longer cared? What if he had moved on? What if seeing him again only reopened wounds she had barely managed to survive? These thoughts kept her trapped between longing and hesitation. Days turned into weeks, and the pull of the desert grew stronger. She found herself standing outside the cafe during breaks, staring toward the distant horizon as if she could see across miles of land. Something inside her felt unfinished, like a story that had stopped in the middle without a proper ending. Then, one morning, she made her decision. She packed her few belongings into a small bag, much like the one she had carried years ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded her clothes, but her heart felt strangely calm. This time she was not running from something, she was walking toward it. She told no one where she was going. With the first light of dawn, she began her journey back to the desert. The town slowly faded behind her, replaced by open land, dry air, and the familiar scent of dust carried by the wind. As she walked, memories returned with vivid clarity. She remembered the first time she had seen the desert stretch endlessly before her, feeling both small and free at the same time. She remembered learning to ride beside him, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. She remembered sitting beside him in silence, feeling more connected to another person than she ever had before. Each step forward felt like stepping back into her past. The sun rose higher in the sky, its heat growing stronger with every passing hour. Her throat grew dry, and her legs began to ache. But she refused to stop. She had come too far to turn back now. The desert, however, did not welcome her gently. As the afternoon approached, a sudden gust of wind swept across the land, lifting clouds of sand into the air. She shielded her face with her arms, squinting through the swirling dust. For a moment she could barely see in front of her. Her heart raced, but she stood her ground. She remembered how he had once taught her to stay calm in such moments, to wait for the storm to pass instead of fighting against it. So she planted her feet firmly in the sand and breathed slowly until the wind softened again. When the air cleared, she continued walking, feeling both tired and determined. As evening approached, the desert began to change color, shifting from bright gold to deep orange and purple. The sky stretched endlessly above her, painted with streaks of fading sunlight. In the distance, she thought she saw something, a dark shape against the glowing horizon. Her breath caught. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her after such a long journey. But as she walked closer, the shape grew clearer. It was not a rock or a shadow. It was a man on horseback. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She slowed her steps, suddenly unsure of herself. After all this time, she was finally seeing him again. The man who had once meant everything to her. The man she had left behind, and who had let her go. He sat tall on his horse, motionless against the darkening sky. His familiar hat shaded his face, just as it always had. The horse beneath him shifted slightly, but he remained still, like a figure carved into the landscape. For a long moment she simply stood there, staring. The distance between them felt both impossibly large and painfully small. Memories, emotions, and unanswered questions flooded her mind all at once. She felt her chest tighten as tears threatened to rise, but she forced herself to stay composed. She wondered if he had recognized her yet. Had he been expecting her? Had he sensed in some quiet way that she was returning? Or was this simply a coincidence, a chance meeting in the vast desert they both called home? Slowly, she began walking again. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of physical exhaustion, but because of emotional weight. She had traveled all this way to face him, yet now that the moment was here, doubt crept in. What would she say to him? Would he speak first, or remain silent as always? Would his eyes hold the same mixture of warmth and distance she remembered? Would he look at her like a stranger, or like someone he had once cared for deeply? As she moved closer, the desert around her seemed to fade into the background. The wind, the heat, the endless sand. All of it disappeared, leaving only her and the cowboy in that quiet space between past and present. He still had not moved. His stillness made her heart ache. It was the same calm, controlled presence she had known so well, yet it felt different now. Heavier, older, shaped by years of solitude. The sky grew darker, the first stars beginning to appear like tiny lights scattered across the vast canvas above them. The air cooled slightly, brushing gently against her skin. She stopped once more, still a distance away from him, and took a deep breath. In that moment, she realized that returning to the desert was not just about seeing him again. It was about facing the part of herself she had left behind. The part that had loved deeply, hoped boldly, and been broken quietly. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived here years ago, lost, unsure, and searching for something she could not name. She thought about how much she had grown since then, how much pain and strength she had carried with her, and yet, despite everything, her heart still pulled toward him. The cowboy finally shifted slightly on his horse, as if sensing her presence more clearly now. His head tilted just a little in her direction, but he did not call out or ride toward her. The silence between them felt thick with meaning. She took another step forward. The desert stretched endlessly around them, but in that moment it felt small, as if their past and present had collided in a single point of time. She did not know what awaited her when she finally reached him. She did not know if she would find closure, rejection, forgiveness, or something else entirely. But she knew one thing with certainty. She had returned, not out of weakness but out of courage, the courage to face the love she had never truly let go of. As the last light of the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, leaving the desert wrapped in soft twilight, she continued toward the silent cowboy, her heart full of both fear and hope. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alive again. Clara had been staying at Jake's ranch for a few weeks now. The air in the desert had a sharpness to it, but also a kind of clarity that made everything feel more alive. The heat during the day would burn down on the land, but the cool desert nights brought a sense of peace. Clara had started to feel a deep connection to the land. The vast, empty horizon stretched out before her, and she felt like it mirrored the open path she had ahead of her. A chance to leave the past behind and build something new. Jake had been patient with her. The quiet cowboy who had once captured her heart without even trying was now teaching her how to handle the horses, fix the fences, and work the land. There was something calming about being around him again. His presence felt like home, but Clara knew that they needed more than just the comfort of familiarity to make things work. Each day was different, and each moment with Jake brought new hope, yet also new doubts. Clara still wasn't entirely sure how to move forward. She'd been hurt so many times in the past that her heart had built walls around it. But slowly, Jake's calm manner and steady support started to break through. He never pushed her to talk about her past, but he always listened when she needed him to. She began to realize that love didn't have to be rushed or forced. It could grow slowly, like the wildflowers in the desert that bloomed in unexpected places. One evening, after a long day of working with the cattle, Clara sat on the porch of the house, her legs stretched out in front of her. The sky was painted with the colors of the setting sun, and she could hear the sound of the wind rustling through the sagebrush. Jake came outside and sat beside her, not saying anything at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward, though. It was peaceful, like they had both learned to simply enjoy being in each other's company.
You ever thought about what comes next? Jake finally asked, his voice low and thoughtful.
Clara hesitated before answering, trying to gather her thoughts. The question felt heavy, but also freeing. It wasn't a question about the past. It was about the future. I don't know, she said softly.
I've spent so much time running from things, trying to fix mistakes, that I forgot what it's like to just be.
I think I'm learning to be here now. She looked at him, her eyes soft. It's different, Jake. It's not the same as it was before. Jake nodded, understanding what she meant. He, too, had been running for a long time, not from Clara, but from his own fears. He had built walls around his heart after losing someone he loved, and the idea of opening up again scared him. But being with Clara felt different.
The more time they spent together, the more he realized that the past didn't have to define them. They could choose to let go of it and make something new, something stronger. I think I'm learning that too, Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. It's not always about rushing or having all the answers.
Sometimes it's just about being honest with each other and taking one step at a time. Clara's heart felt lighter with each word he spoke. For so long she had feared that she would never be able to trust again, that her past mistakes would haunt her forever. But here, with Jake, she began to understand that healing was a process, not a sudden fix.
She wasn't broken. She was learning, growing, and building something new.
Over the next few weeks, Clara and Jake continued to grow closer. They didn't need grand gestures or dramatic moments. Instead, they found comfort in the small things, the way their hands brushed when they worked together, the quiet talks late into the night, and the way Jake would always make sure she was safe, no matter how hard the work on the ranch was. They didn't speak about the past much. Instead, they focused on the present, and that was enough. One morning, Clara woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. The desert was still and silent, and she felt a sense of peace in the air. She went outside to watch the sunrise, standing alone in the cool morning air. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the world in soft shades of pink and orange. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while she felt truly at peace. Jake came up behind her, his footsteps quiet on the ground. He stood next to her, looking out at the horizon with her. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was comfortable. Clara felt the weight of everything she had been carrying start to lift, and in its place, there was a sense of calm and hope. I think I'm ready, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake turned to her, his eyes soft.
Ready for what? To move forward, to be with you, and to see where this takes us, she said, smiling gently. I'm not perfect, and neither are you.
But I'm willing to try. If you are. Jake didn't hesitate. He took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch reassuring her that they were on the same path. I've always been ready, he said, his voice steady and sure. From that moment, things began to change. Clara and Jake continued to build their life together on the ranch, working side by side, supporting each other, and learning how to love again. There were still challenges ahead, but Clara knew that she didn't have to face them alone anymore. She had found something worth holding on to, a love that didn't need to be perfect, but one that was real, slow, and steady, just like the desert they had both come to love. And as they watched another sunset together, Clara knew that she had made the right choice. It wasn't about begging for love or trying to turn back time. It was about accepting the past, learning from it, and choosing to walk forward with Jake hand in hand into whatever the future held.